The Memory Police. A beautiful, sedate swan resting on a seemingly serene lake only to realize it's being pulled under 1 centimeter at a time once it's almost fully submerged and too late. Okay, so I got The Memory Police here. It is a sci-fi, speculative fiction, dystopian book written by, I'm going to mispronounce the name, not on purpose, Yoko Ogawa. It was originally published in 1994, but only was translated into English in 2019. So a fairly new-ish book for English readers. And I happened to find it at a little library, and it is like one of the best things I've ever found at a free little library. I don't even remember what I exchanged for it, but I'm pretty sure I won out and got the better deal. Let's talk about it. It is poetic, dystopian, gentle, dark, subtle, vague, soft, charming, and esoteric. That's a lot of words. I'll give you a little summary. No spoilers. We basically have a female protagonist. She's a novelist. She lives alone. I believe this is supposed to be somewhere in Japan, but it's like a fictional place. They're on an island, and I believe it was contemporary times as well, so would have been the mid-90s or the early 90s that it was set in. On this island, objects just disappear. Things disappear. And everyone kind of has a feeling that it's going to happen, but they don't know what it is right away until the next day, I guess they wake up and they realize, or they leave the house and they realize these things don't exist anymore, or that they are getting swept into the ocean was one of the things, or they sometimes have to go and destroy these things that they have that are supposed to have been disappeared, but they still exist, but they have to destroy them sometimes. And sometimes they do that by burning, right? So based off of what I can give you without spoilers, and it's funny because I always think that things are spoilers when other people may not, because I like to go into things pretty blind, like movies and books, like almost as blind as possible. Even music sometimes too. Like I will buy an album sometimes on the strength of one single, and that doesn't turn out well sometimes. But I don't want to know the whole album before I buy it. Anyway, with books, I tend to go in pretty blind. I would say more blind than I go into movies, where I'm like, oh, it looks really cool. I read a little bit, and then I just don't want to know anymore. So this is more than I would know, or more than I would need to know before going into the book, but it is on the back of the book. So her publisher, because she's a novelist, her publisher ends up needing a hiding place and hides in her house, basically in a little bunker secret space under her floorboards in a little room that gets made for him. In this world, people that remember the things that disappear are in danger and are taken away. I mentioned that this is a dystopian fiction, sci-fi, speculative fiction, but the dystopianness of it definitely is present. Some folks, some critics, compare it to 1984 and Fahrenheit 451, which I understand why they would do that, but I believe it was a little careless on their part because they made the blurbs pretty short, and I think that if you're going to compare it to such hallmarks of dystopian fiction, that you would need to qualify that a little bit, because this is dystopian and it has a very vague whisper of 1984's authoritative government in it. A little bit of Big Brother with the memory police themselves. And the Fahrenheit 451 aspect is there. There is some censorship that I think is happening here. Freedoms are lost in both of those cases, or in things like Brave New World as well, or other dystopian fictions. V for Vendetta would be another one that we've got authoritarian governments, we've got things being censored and taken away, and that is what's happening here. But it is, like I've mentioned, it was so gentle. It is dark, but it's gentle and it's subtle and it's soft. I said it was charming. It's also esoteric. I mentioned poetic, and it's vague. Well, we're going to get to all that right away here. I was intrigued to read it. I was excited to read it. It won a National Book Award. It was just a finalist. It didn't win. Sorry. But it just seemed like really good, like based off the blurbs and stuff that I had read just on the book itself. Because remember, I found it just in a little library. Never heard of it before. Never heard of the author before. But I was intrigued. I was like, you know what? I could use some dystopian fiction that I've never heard of before, because there's a lot of classic dystopian fictions that I've read, and I enjoy them a lot. I'm very plot-driven in my reading pathway, which we will discuss in a minute here. So I was really interested in it. But foreshadowing, because the way I've been speaking about it, it fell a little flat for me, and I'm going to discuss why. But first, I think that if you are into dystopian books, I think, or speculative fiction, I don't see the sci-fi element really here. I wouldn't put it in a sci-fi, I wouldn't put it under that umbrella at all. I think that there are dystopian fictions that would fit nicely under that umbrella, but I don't think this is one of them. But yeah, if you like that type of vibe, I guess, then I would say that this probably will also intrigue you. If your reading pathways are language, I think this will really fill your cup. Plot is my first reading pathway, and language is my second. And I mentioned the book being very poetic and charming and soft and subtle. And it is. And there's a juxtaposition between the reality of what's happening and also the language being used. When I think back on reading 1984, it was just a very brutalist, dark, strong book, and the language seemed to reflect that a lot. Here, the things that are happening, we don't see that imagery of strength. We see subtle, soft, subversive things that are happening kind of in the background where people don't know a certain amount, and our protagonist is left in the dark a lot of the time as well, and only knows so much. And the language is beautiful, and I think that one thing this book did really well is that it charmed me into this state where I was lulled by the language, and I was not on edge or anxious or stressed about these things that were happening as much as I could have been if the language was different but the plot was the same. So if you appreciate beautiful language, very poetic language and verse, I think you will enjoy this. This is one of the most gentle books that I've read in its language, and I don't know how to express it. But it has this quality of softness to it that is just wonderful. If you're okay with an open ending, then I think that you won't be as upset with this book as I am. I'm really on the fence about open endings, and I will discuss that a little further here too. This book is a lot of process and not a lot of product. So what I mean by that is that if you really appreciate the process of what's happening, then again, I think that this book will be for you. I think you'll enjoy it. But I'm very plot-driven, and part of what I learned a lot about myself and what I enjoy reading from this book. And I did enjoy this book. Overall, I enjoyed it. But it did let me down a bit. And that's because part of what I learned was that what I enjoy is process and product. Sometimes the product is the process, and that's okay with me. So sometimes there are books that are kind of more like slice of life books, and just like that can be hit or miss for me. And sometimes the ending, it's just like, hey, that's just life, and that's it. And that doesn't feel as open of an ending to me. It feels like that when I talk about product, I just mean the ending. Like, what did we end up with? What was the lesson learned or whatever? And sometimes when I'm talking about the process being the product, I think that this book is so much process. Like, you're on this journey, you're enjoying it, it's wonderful language. There are some suspenseful moments. It definitely keeps. I keep wanting to read it. It's not slow. It's not dry by any means. It makes me want to read it and figure things out. But about 3/4 of the way through, I realized there is so much that is unexplained. I have so many questions. We are not going to answer this in the last quarter of the book. I don't think it's going to happen. And at that point, I started feeling, I don't know if impatient is the right word, but I started thinking a lot about that. And thinking like, man, why aren't we getting answers to all these things? Like, obviously there's things that we could know here, but we are left in the dark, much like the protagonist is. We don't know why things happen. So, again, like, if you really, really enjoy process more than product, I think you'll enjoy this. Again, open-ended plot, open endings in general, if you're okay with those, I think you'll be okay with this. For me, I'm on the fence about those things. They have to really be done the right way, and this one didn't hit me the right way. If I want to talk about its importance, I would say I don't think it's as important as other dystopian fictions that I've read. I don't think it just kicks the door wide open with some new stuff that makes us think about things in a new way. Maybe I just missed some of that stuff, and that happens. But I will say that the gentleness is really interesting, and for the subject, it was a very pleasant read. It was a much more pleasant read than any other dystopian fiction I've ever read. Just by language alone, it was beautiful, and just the way that characters expressed themselves and just how the plot unfolded very, very softly. You kind of end up in a boiled frogs situation where, again, the ending kind of creeps up on you and you realize, I'm not going to get these answers. And it just depends on how you feel about that kind of thing. If you're okay with not getting those answers or not. This is tough for placing it on the shelf for me. I feel like a lot of the times I'm really hot or cold on books or just media in general. And this one was tough because it was a great read. I got through it pretty quickly. I really enjoyed it. Except the ending really left a bad taste in my mouth because I just didn't get an ending. I didn't get things wrapped up enough, and it wasn't open enough. Like, oh, this is just a slice of life. This is just. If I think about books like Revolutionary Road or All the Pretty Horses, there's another one I had in my head, Middlesex by Jeffrey Eugenides. Those are kind of like slice of life books with open endings in a way that there isn't meant to be an ending. It's just like, this is life. This is what happens. There's not a specific, it's not some crazy thing where it's not a whodunit. We're not trying to, there's no answers to this. I can appreciate those books, and it took reading a couple of them for me to appreciate them more because I usually like to have questions and answers. I like things to throw questions at me. This book doesn't really give me questions in that aspect of like introspective searching for answers of myself. What it does is it makes me wonder things about the plot that I never get solved, and that I did not enjoy. So for me, shelf placement, I would say it's the middle of the shelf. I don't think I would read it again. It was enjoyable to read because it was just so different from anything I had read. Just the presentation of the plot, again, that language that was used, the diction was just really quite wonderful. But for me, I needed more of the product, not just the process. And that's what I really learned about myself. So for me, I'd place it on the middle of the shelf, not because it was a poorly written book at all. It's just not my cup of tea. And so I would definitely encourage other people to read it if I know that they're into this kind of thing. I don't think it's a useless book by any means. I just think that it's really hard to put it on the middle. Like, I feel like it's got to go between the middle and high. It's like mid-high on the shelf. I need to give it that at least. It is wonderfully written. Again, it's just that you know how some people complain about the show Lost, about how all these things are introduced and you don't get the answers? That's how I felt. I still really like Lost for how much entertainment there was in that show, but this is like deeper than just surface level entertainment. There's a lot of things going on here, and I feel like I could have learned more. But again, just me personally, and I think it is a personal thing, that I just needed more of that plot answered. I'm too curious, and I didn't get that fed, which made me learn a lot about what I like to read and what I'm not super satisfied with. But again, it was very soft and gentle and delicate. However, there were some things that, like I said, there is a darkness there in the plot of like this thing happening and we don't know why, and there are some moments of suspense, but they're pretty subdued in a way too. It is dystopian, which automatically interests me, but it's like the most soft and gentle dystopian I've ever read, which made it really interesting. And that's all I have to say about that, The Memory Police.